not he who tells. Chapter 6. World Between the Worlds. It didn't feel like stepping into a room. It felt like going outside, out of a known and into a vast, blank, alien openness. It was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. For several seconds, all I could see was the back of Pope's coat as he moved ahead of me. And then the door behind us swung closed, and there was nothing but darkness. It seemed to me that many minutes went by. Pope said nothing. We moved in the vast space with no sound, no sense of boundaries or edges. Finally, Pope spoke, and as he did, light leaked into the air around us. "Welcome to the world between the worlds," he said with no relish. His voice was very small and flat. You aren't seeing it as it really is, because technically there isn't anything to see. This is the void, the opposite of something, which is not, as the unimaginative might suppose, nothing. Nothing is just the absence of something. This is the reverse side of the mirror, where something comes out on the other side of nothing. The light grew, or my eyes adjusted to it. Around us were things. They were about the size and shape of watermelons, but meatier and disconcertingly pulpy. Colorless pods raised on fat stalks, each one rocking slightly, waving as if in a slight breeze, though the air, if that's what it was perfectly still. At first, I could only see the ones directly around us, but the light spread out, and there were more of them. Hundreds of dull, purplish pods nodding stupidly in the void. Finally, I could see there were countless numbers of them, stretching away into the blackness on all sides, an eye-watering gulf of mute, undulating shapes. "This is where the stories come from," I said, testing the sound of it. It sounded right. Pope moved aimlessly among the pods, and I followed. As my eyes grew accustomed to the strange light, I noticed what I assumed was a layer of rustling vegetation under the swaying globes. I bent down to look and saw that the surface we walked on was a bed of wrinkled, leathery husks, the remains of empty pods. I picked one up gingerly. Pope stopped and looked back at the dried sack in my hands, frowning slightly. Then he said, "That one made it out." I looked from his expression to the unpleasant limp shape in my hands. It felt a little like the skin of a long-deceased Halloween pumpkin left to settle into itself in the weeds next to the porch. "You mean it became a story? It got written down, recorded, embodied somehow?" Pope nodded slowly, still looking at the dried sack. "Not all of them make it, but some find the right conduit and get through. That one you have in your hands, do you know what it is?" "How could I?" I stopped suddenly, squinting at it. I realized it wasn't entirely anonymous. There was something in it that suggested a shape to my hands. Or not a shape exactly, but the memory of a shape. I stared at the thing, fascinated and vaguely repelled. There was something wrong with holding it, something I couldn't quite wrap my mind around. The shape the husk suggested was cold, hollow, and old. But those weren't the things about it that made my hands feel alien, somehow impossible. There was a chilling, growing sense of violation, of wasted places raped with icy blackness, packed like the mouth of a corpse filled with motor oil. There was something else, something almost intolerably sickening and pervasive, sluggish but utterly implacable, huge, I dropped the husk and lunged backwards from it, barking a harsh cry of revulsion. For a moment, I thought I was going to vomit massively. My stomach and throat clenched, and I uttered a helpless, strangled "Hurt." Then the feeling passed, quickly, as soon as the thing was out of my hands. I stared at where it lay, limp and pathetic, then looked down at my hands, shivering. The thing had been cold, dead, and empty. But what had been fundamentally, shockingly wrong with it was that for a few seconds I had held in my two hands several 100 tons of rotting, rusting, waterlogged iron. Pope was smiling vaguely, ruefully. How comically appropriate that you'd come across that specific one, I rubbed my hands on my jeans, trying to scrub that feeling of cold, alien massiveness out of them. But the Titanic, I said hastily, unthinkingly. There isn't any story written about the Titanic. That was real. Pope didn't answer. He continued to look at me with that rueful half-smile, as if encouraging me. And then I remembered. It was one of those strange little factoids that people like me pick up and treasure. The book had been called Futility by a retired British naval officer. In the story, the ship was called the Titan. It was the world's largest, claimed unsinkable. On its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, the ship's crew attempt a record-breaking speed crossing. Halfway through its journey, the Titan strikes an iceberg, fatally wounding the ship. The Titan sinks quickly, leaving very few survivors due to a woeful shortage of lifeboats. My mind raced as I stared at the mysterious husk at my feet. But futility, I muttered. That was written 15 years before the Titanic was even built. 14, Pope corrected me. The Titanic is an interesting case. She still exists, to a degree, at the bottom of the Atlantic, but she loses bits of herself every day. Her disembodiment is slow and agonizing. I can only imagine it. Her story attempted to embody itself too soon, stretching right back into its own world, but to a point decades before its own creation. Perhaps it meant for futility to be a warning, a way of saving the Titanic from its own fate. Convoluted, to be sure, but not impossible to imagine, not for the likes of us. My eyes were riveted to the husk of the Titanic. It was crazy, but I was beginning to believe it. Really believe it. In an infinite number of universes, all stories are true. I straightened up and looked around, awestruck. Millions, billions of stories spawned to life by the osmosis of messy human history leaked into the world between the worlds, and now just wanting to live again, to be real, to be told. Billions of stories, all seeking a conduit. A cold, quiet horror began to creep up my back, freezing me to the spot. I could feel them. The pods waved and nodded vaguely. Each suggested a shape, a place, a feeling, and they were communicating them to me. Not just some of them, all of them. They were tiny, but insistent and hungry. Hungry. I turned my head slowly and looked at Pope. His smile was gone. "We'll be leaving soon," he said, and glanced around quickly. "I hope," his expression and body language added. "There's just one more thing we have to discuss." I began to walk again, idly, nervously. I tried to ignore the voices of the pods, but my brain rebelled against me, tuning them in. Or maybe the pods were tuning me in, becoming aware of me and my conduit, focusing on me. I tried to distract myself, kicking up some of the husks that littered the ground in various stages of desiccation. Each one I kicked released a puff of dry memory directly into my forebrain, and each memory was hauntingly familiar. A beetle-like taxicab wrecked in front of a hospital, a woman's severed head held in a doctor's hands, breathing. A dead old woman lying in the dark, her grandson creeping towards her, horrified but duty-bound. A very tall man in a long, ugly coat, a hat hiding his eyes, a hand outstretched with implacable authority. "Come with me, Thun. I'm a policeman." I stopped kicking the pod husks and looked up, and halted in my tracks. There was a new shape in front of me. I blinked at it stupidly for several seconds, trying to make some mental connection that would explain it. I gave up, momentarily forgetting the whispering voices of the pods and the mystery of the way home from here. I turned to Pope, suddenly expecting him to laugh at me, as if this was all some extremely elaborate practical joke. "What?" I demanded flatly. "The hell is that?" Pope was approaching me slowly from behind, his eyes on the object and not on me. His hands were stuffed almost nervously in his pockets, and he was fidgeting with them, making the tail of his coat bob and flap among the pods. "What does it look like to you?" he asked very carefully. I turned back to it. I stared at it and nodded curtly, pressing my lips together. It was a straightforward question. "It looks," I answered succinctly, "like a throne." It stood on a little dais covered in red carpet. The chair itself was ridiculously baroque, covered in flaking gilt. The seat was a purple velvet cushion fringed with gold piping. On the back of the chair was my name, engraved in large Gothic letters. The letters were the only thing odd about the throne, which otherwise looked like a fairly cheap prop from the local JC's theater. The letters spelling my name seemed to shimmer, as if in a heat haze. I looked back at Pope again. Refreshingly, my primary feeling was annoyance. He was still looking at the throne intensely, squinting. "Yes," he said very quietly, "a throne." I arched my eyebrows and waved a hand at him, interrupting his eye contact with the thing. He glanced up, eyes wide. "What's it mean?" I demanded curtly. "How the hell should I know?" he answered a bit shrilly. "It's your goddamn symbol." I looked at the throne again, then back at him. Pope returned my gaze a bit desperately, sweat beading on his forehead. Then, to my surprise, he reached up, pushed his glasses up, and pressed a thumb and forefinger against his eyes, frowning and shaking his head. He looked diminished. His hair was greasy and disheveled. There were flecks of dandruff on the collar of his black trench coat. "This isn't right," he muttered to himself. It was almost a whine. "What?" I insisted, and took a step toward him, turning to face him full on. He jumped, jerking his head up to look at me wild-eyed. "I don't know this part. How the hell should I know?" he said in an accusing voice. "I've never been in here before, or out here, or whatever the hell it is. I don't even know how to get back myself. Nobody's supposed to be able to get in here at all. It's one of the rules in the book." He brandished the myth of fiction, clutched it in front of him, and stared down at it. This is really, really unusual," he finished lamely. I stood there and looked at him, mentally replaying what he'd just said. Then why are we here? What's this about? Pope looked miserable. He glanced around the undulating landscape again. When he spoke, he didn't make eye contact. "They told me it'd be easy, no big thing. They just wanted me to get you here. They wanted to see. They told me I could write about it afterwards if I wanted to. They said it'd be a unique experience." I knew what that meant. Oh, yes, you better believe I did. He raised his eyes now and looked at me plaintively, desperately. "I'd lost it. You see that, right? My conduit. It was gone. You talk about it like you'd love to close it down, get rid of it. But you don't know what it's like when it's all you have. I was like one of those dead husks. When they came to me, told me about you and what they wanted me to do, I knew that they'd been responsible for it. They'd cut me off, left me to go crazy, scratching at it, trying to bring it back, writing meaningless drivel and getting claustrophobia of the brain. He balled a fist and beat it against his forehead. I knew they'd done it to me to make me agree to this job, but I didn't care. I was just so relieved that I could have my writing back. Nobody could blame me for that. Nobody, not even you. My annoyance was turning to anger, but underneath it, the terror was creeping and crawling. Hope almost seemed to be shrinking. Fear came off him like a stink. Who? I asked, almost kindly. Who came to you? Who gave you this job? Pope shook his head, dropping his eyes. He looked like a kid trying quick to think of a lie that would fit the same shape as the truth. Then he froze. His eyes went glassy and very still. Finally, he raised them to me slowly and answered in a quiet, awed voice. Low men in yellow coats. I felt rooted to the ground, petrified. Is that what they told you to say? Pope's eyes glistened. He didn't move. After a long silence, I asked, what was it they sent you to find out? What were they trying to see? Pope shifted as if he wasn't going to answer. I took another half step toward him and he jumped, as if out of a trance. His eyes jittered faintly as he watched me. All right. Yes, I can tell you that. It's not a secret. It's just very, very unusual, I supplied. Yes, he agreed quickly, looking at the throne again. Yes, very. All right. You see now, don't you, where the stories come from? You know the basic truth. In a universe of infinite dimensions, all stories are true. Everything happens. Everything is real. There is no such thing as fiction, I confirmed. His eyes snapped back to me. Yes! He nodded emphatically. Yes, normally. His eyes unfocused, and he looked down at the book in his hands again, apparently thinking furiously. Normally, he said again, less confidently. Hope! There has only been one exception, he stammered, backing away a step. Just one completely original piece of fiction, one utterly raw creation. That's what I was sent to investigate. It shouldn't even be possible, but it happened. By an apparently huge force of will, Pope collected himself. He took a deep, shuddering breath. When he looked me in the eyes, he seemed more himself. His voice was calmer, resigned. It's you, he said, exhaling hard. You made the fiction, and it's you. I digested this for a moment, running into what seemed to be some fairly obvious objections. Pope clutched the book in one hand and held up the other in a placating manner. Or not. Maybe it's the other way around, he said lamely. I shook my head slowly, watching him. Pope sighed again, exasperated. It happened decades ago. You were getting your first taste of success as a writer, and you wondered, would I be able to do it all over again? I answered, nodding. I know the story. I was there. Yes, you wondered if you'd be able to do it again, so you decided to try. You invented another person, a name, and you wrote under that name for a while. Several books, successful ones, not necessarily your best works, a bit rougher around the edges if I recall. I gestured impatiently and rolled my eyes. Yes, I read the reviews too. It was a pseudonym. It was supposed to read differently, otherwise there was no point. Are you telling me that one of the books I wrote under the name... No! Hope interrupted suddenly with surprising vehemence. Not one of the goddamn stories. The name itself. The name was the fiction. The first and only real fiction ever created in the cosmos, in the fucking multiverse. I opened my mouth, then shut it again. Part of me was ready to laugh at the notion, but another part of me wasn't laughing at all. Part of me wasn't even surprised. Pope boggled at me. "It wasn't just a pseudonym," he breathed urgently. "You created a character for the part. He has a history, a personality, a family. You weren't even trying, but you brought him into being. You made him happen. And he did happen. Out there in one of those myriad other dimensions, hell, in millions of them, he lives and works. He was born, grew up, wrote books, and died," I mused thoughtfully. "No," Pope rasped. "He didn't die. That's the point." "But he did," I said, keeping my voice calm. I didn't feel calm. All of a sudden, I felt about 1 billion miles away from calm. I killed him. Somebody found out my secret, and I decided to have some fun with it. So I wrote his eulogy. I made him, and then I killed him off. He'd served his purpose. Pope grinned meanly. "No, that's where you're wrong, and that's where things get, to put it mildly, interesting. You tried to kill him off, but at some point after you made him, you stopped controlling him. He became his own. You tried to kill him, and he decided not to be killed after all." Pope's grin cinched a notch tighter and became a rictus. For a moment, his face didn't even look like his own. In a chillingly strange, dead voice, he added, "I guess you should have tried a little harder." Then the grin deflated and he crumpled inside his coat, like a suddenly abandoned puppet. A shiver thrilled down my back, shaking me. "So what's this to me?" I said hoarsely, looking around at the throne, my name engraved on the back, shimmering, hard to read. "I'm retiring anyway, if I can, and I do think I can, despite all of this." "You still don't get it, do you?" Pope whispered from beside me now. He sounded more himself, but shaken and tired. "You think it clears everything up, that you feel real, that you are the truth, and everything else is stage dressing and poster paint. It must be reassuring." I was looking at the throne, trying to read the name. "What do you mean?" I asked very slowly, my stomach sinking, my blood going cold. Pope looked aside at me, studied me. "You're finally getting it," he replied softly. "Now you see why they've been so curious about getting a closer look at you." He drew a shaking breath and narrowed his eyes. "At both of you." I stared at the throne. The name shimmered and pulsed. I knew what Pope didn't want to say, and it defied my mind, my heart, every shred of my being. I couldn't accept it. It was patently absurd, and I knew it was true. I had made him, and somehow, simultaneously, he had made me as well. "That can't be," I told Pope simply. "It's impossible." "Yes," Pope agreed instantly, nodding vigorously. "Impossible. One of us is real. The other is a pseudonym, a fiction, an invention. Absolutely. No question," he said with conviction. I turned to face Pope. His eyes darted from the throne to my face. He looked old. We were only a foot apart. I drew a breath and held it, terrified to ask what I knew I had to ask. Pope saw it in my eyes. "Which one of us is the real one?" I demanded finally, flatly. Pope stared hard at me for several long seconds. Then he began to swing his head slowly from side to side in helpless negation, clutching the myth of fiction to his chest. He began to step backwards through the gently waving pods, and they moved aside for him. "By the gods," he said in a cracked whisper, his eyes nailed on mine. "We don't know. We don't know." And then things began to get weird. time became a bouncing ball, arcing here and landing there in explosive lunges. I woke up, and I was no longer in the world between the worlds. I was home, in my chair by the fire. It was snowing. It was Christmas, and the family was coming over. My wife answered the door, and in I came, carrying armloads of presents, all of them bearing tags with my own name. I was a kid, growing up, going to school, and Pope was my English teacher, grinning a painfully tight rictus that didn't affect his eyes at all. He handed me my composition, and it was covered in A+, plastered with them, in cramped, shaking red handwriting, completely obliterating my penmanship. I was Max, wearing my wolf suit in the land of the wild things, taming them with my magic trick of staring into their great yellow eyes and signing copies of the myth of fiction. And at one point, near the end, I was back in the world between the worlds. Pope was gone, but I wasn't alone. Something was among the pods, rustling them, hiding in their undulating pulpy secrecy, moving toward me and laughing under its breath. I stood before the throne, afraid to turn my back on the thing in the pods, but more afraid to take my eyes off the shimmering name on the back of the throne. I knew if it solidified into my name, I could sit on it and it would be over, gloriously over. And then, as I heard the thing in the pods finally stand up behind me, felt it reach for my shoulder to turn me, to make me look at it, the name did solidify, and I sat. And then there was just nothing, which, as you know, is the blissful absence of something. Nothing, to my surprise, was white.